everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thanks also to those who attended last sessions. Just a little reminder that we now have our YouTube channel for the Environmental Justice Program, and all the last sessions of the modeling seminar were recorded and are now on the YouTube channel, including the one that we had 2 weeks ago by Diego Domingos, and which I think was really interesting. So now today we will be listening to Dr. Carey King, who is a research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin and is also the assistant director at the Energy Institute. And today he will talk about modeling energy and macroeconomic interactions, and talk about the challenges and questions of agency. And I think we agreed on having a rather informal seminar, so that we could, after your presentation, have a moment to discuss together, which is always very interesting. So thank you again, Doctor, for accepting this invitation and for presenting today. And I think the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll try to share some thoughts I think presented to this group. I was looking 2 years ago, and so now it's kind of roughly 2 years later, and I'll be less economically formal than Tiago, perhaps. So for everyone's background, my background is mechanical engineering, and so when I come at macroeconomic modeling, everything I've learned in the last 7 or 8 years, and learned from people such as you in this group. So I'll summarize some of the things I'm thinking about and the modeling that I'm working on. So, essentially almost everything I've published is in this one paper. I've got 2 papers, but they're very similar in terms of the model. And this is the results I presented last time we spoke. And I'll summarize some of this before, but this is a stock and flow consistent biophysical economic model. So the principle is to track mass and conceptually energy at the same time as tracking stocks and flows of money. And this model is simple. It's just an economy living off of a sort of a regenerative resource like a forest. So it's relatively simple, but hopefully demonstrates some fundamental principles. And it made me think a lot more about biological growth and analogs to biological growth because of the structure of the model itself and the patterns. So that's what I'm going to summarize a little bit here. So in my book that I wrote, it came out 2 years ago, The Economic Superorganism, this is kind of a simplistic way to think about it, but in some sense, you can think of the world as matter, information, and energy. And so matter is kind of simply how much stuff is there. If I were better at physics, I wouldn't separate these. I would put them all together, I think. Then there's information, which is kind of how do you arrange the matter. And then there's energy, which is, so to say, how much effort does it take, or what's the cost to arrange the matter? And what's not really addressed there, there's many things, of course, but one of it is who decides, or how does it decide? How do you decide which matter gets arranged, or what matter doesn't get arranged? So who makes a decision here? And the more I get into macroeconomic modeling, there are certain assumptions you make, which type of entity is making a decision or has a behavior. And I'm wondering how much this affects the outcomes of the model itself. So in the biological scaling, or the biological relationships between energy and mass, so a lot of my understanding or desire to model the economy is because I'm a sort of energy scientist by training at heart. And so I want to understand the fundamental relationships between natural resources, primarily energy resources, and the economy, all kinds of things about the economy. And when we look at the biological systems, people would study the scaling of metabolism B here on the left to the mass or the size of the organism. And what's the scaling exponent beta in this case here, and how do these relate? So here's a paper from 2010 that does a sort of nice summary of scaling from small to large organisms. And at the smallest scale, the smallest organisms are single cell prokaryotes like bacteria, and they have seemingly a superlinear scaling. So this beta is greater than 1. A 10 times larger bacteria consumes more than 10 times the energy, or has a metabolism that's more than 10 times as large. Then you get into protists, or essentially eukaryotic single cells, and these have a near 1-to-1 scaling, indicated here in the middle. So 10 times bigger protist, approximately 10 times more energy consumption. And then you get larger, and you have multi-cell organisms, and the multi-cell organisms have sublinear scaling, or a beta that is less than 1. So a 10 times larger multi-cell organism has less than 10 times the more energy consumption. And so that is a sort of interesting progression of size. And then the questions are how much this does or does not, or should we relate this to the economy, or should this somehow be replicated when we do economic models, or how can it inform that? On the previous slide was just relatively small multi-cell organisms. And then here, as you go to mammals, this is the well-known Kleiber's rule. If anybody knows the correct way to pronounce his name. But the 3/4 power scaling law here, known for primarily mammals. But again, it's a sublinear scaling, so 10 times bigger animal, you get approximately 5.6 times more basal metabolism for this animal. And then, interestingly, the same type of sublinear scaling that holds for multicellular single animals, single organisms, holds for superorganisms like ant colonies. So this is, again, the mass of an ant colony on the bottom x-axis, and then the metabolic rate on the y-axis. And depending on which species you're looking at here, or genus, there are different scaling factors from this particular paper, but they're all less than 1. And so that's my focus here. And so this even holds for fungus farming ants. And if you count the energy consumed essentially by the growing fungus, then you still, of course, have this sublinear scaling. And Gail and I are working on a proposal with Chen Hao, the co-author of this paper that produced this result on the right. And this is a relatively simple experiment where they stuck only worker harvester ants in a chamber. And by putting in more ants into the chamber, measured their carbon dioxide production and inferred their metabolism from that. And again, you get this sublinear scaling. If you have 10 times more ants in the experiment, you don't have 10 times the metabolism. You have a metabolism that scales to the approximate 3/4 power, in this case 0.73. And the rationale for this from their experiment was that as you add more ants to the experiment, there's a higher percentage of ants that are inactive, in the sense that they do not walk around actively collecting food or seeking for the food in the experimental chamber. So this brings up questions of, in some sense, perhaps agency. How is an ant deciding, or what is the signal indicating for the ant to walk around or not? Is this a factor of the size of the environment? It's a factor of how many ants are in the environment? All kinds of things like this. So this is relatively simple. It's not a real ant colony measurement. There's no queen ant. There's no larva. They're not caring for a brood. They're not growing a fungus. They're just collecting seeds and walking around and bringing them back to the nest. So this is kind of the general shape that appears from that literature. You have superlinear scaling at very small mass. Then you have a near linear scaling at larger masses, but maybe single cells. And then once you get to multi-cell organisms, you have some type of sublinear scaling. The theories for describing this, I suppose, range from network expansion and the physical space that networks take up, as well as the dissipation, the power or energy dissipation in networks as you distribute physical mass along a network, like a circulatory system of a mammal. And then there's the literature referring to dynamic energy budgets as a theory, and that there's a change in the amount of storage or sort of fat or energy storage that occurs in an animal when it grows. So I'm not an expert on necessarily any of those, but this is my takeaway from this type of literature. And at some level, you just have an increasing coordination of parts. Or is it coordination? Is it coercion? Anyway, there's some rule that restricts the options of what any particular part of the system can do, a cell in the case of a biological organism, as you accumulate more and more cells. So then the question we could ask is, we accumulate more and more things in the economy, does the same thing happen? Does each new thing that gets acquired in the economy have a restriction on how it can, or at least a reduction in the ability of it to operate? So when you look at the global economy, there's a similar scaling progression, or perhaps a similar scaling progression. These are global data here shown, and the x-axis is estimate of real GDP, and the y-axis is total primary energy consumption, and from 1900 to roughly 2010. So
can I ask you a quick question, Carey?
Yeah, go ahead, right here. Stop here.
Thanks. Yeah, it's just because you mentioned, and I don't know this literature. I don't know what's actually what's behind what you quickly said. You quickly said that the reason for this scaling, this changing scaling of the metabolic energy that the organism can process when its mass changes has been explained in the literature by networks and network theory. And so my question is just this, if it can be explained just with network theory, then it's actually intrinsic to the organism and it doesn't take into account its environment, right?
Right. I think I think you bring up a good point. I probably don't have the answer to your question, but I think the question in my mind as well, right? So the ant experiment, at least, has a well-defined environment. It's the size of the experiment, and so something that we proposed is changing the size of the experiment to see how this changes the scaling of the ants. For an organism or a single, like a mammal, I'm not sure how to do that, but one of the papers that it tries to explain the 3/4 power scaling of Kleiber's rule is pretty much just geometric. That a network takes up space, and an organism is only a certain size volume, and it in some sense has to scale its distribution network, and not necessarily a fractal manner, but from your aorta coming out of your heart, and then it branches off into 2, and then it branches off into 4, etc. And each one of these becomes smaller. And so to get the nutrients to your cells, there is something, I don't know if we would call it environmental, I guess a diffusion rate from capillaries into cells that in some sense can't change no matter how big of an organism you are, right? It's in some sense roughly the same diffusion rate, no matter how big you are, and that somehow feeds back into the scaling literature. So some of it discusses it in terms of actual dissipation of going to a longer and longer network, all the way down to capillaries, for example. And some of the explanations are kind of purely geometric. So it's a little bit across the board, and I haven't been able to wrap my head around the consistency or inconsistency of all of them. But as you pointed out, I would say, I guess most of them don't relate to the environment itself, like how you get food from the environment. They're mostly about basal metabolism. So assuming that's not a constraint, I suppose. Otherwise, the organism, I guess, shrinks and dies.
Carey, I have a question on this, a clarification.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me, one way to interpret that is to say that there are increasing returns to scale. The larger the number of cells, or the larger the number of ants, the less energy you need per unit. So that's why it's subscaling. So actually, I would have guessed there is less dissipation. It's more efficient.
I guess per unit. So the other way, yeah, I guess I may have a slide here. I guess these are consistent. Yeah, and the question is, how do we phrase it in a way that's consistent with people think? Later on here, I'll pose that what necessarily has to happen is that each individual unit of mass has to consume less energy.
Yeah.
And so that's not an efficiency argument. That's to say, if you want to accumulate another unit of mass, it's got to consume less. Whether it's efficient or not, it's the same efficiency in some sense. Like in a body, as my body's growing, I can probably posit that my cells, that when I'm an adult, are not more efficient than the cells when I'm as a child. So I don't know if I view it as efficiency. It seems like it's more of a physical relationship.
Well, then it depends entirely upon how much work is produced by this entity.
On the form.
For the same amount of work, it's clearly an efficiency. Now, of course, if the big organism produces less work, then I agree with you.
But the bigger organism is definitely producing more work because the metabolism is still going up and the work it produces is still going up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's doing more work per mass. Yes.
Okay.
But yeah, we can obviously continue the discussion on how to think about the concept of efficiency with these kinds of scaling. And it gets to the end of, a little bit of the presentation here.
Okay, thank you.
So if we look at the economy, then, and try to look at it the same way, many people have plotted these kinds of data together, GDP and energy consumption, and posited the analog of biological growth to economic growth. And there's a early period here, which may be a statistical anomaly or not, of starting in 1900 of superlinear growth, exponential growth. And then a period after roughly 1917 to 1974, that essentially being the break point of the oil crises of the 1970s, of nearly linear growth, our relationship here, and then the sublinear scaling after the 1970s. And so a lot of times when people think about economic modeling, they might project, right, this continuing energy intensity decline or this continuing sublinear scaling going on into the future for some energy scenario, yet that's usually or often an exogenous assumption that doesn't really explain how this scaling occurs within the economy itself, just assuming the economy will continue on this path. But if we look at this, the economy hasn't been on a single scaling path in its history. And so if we better understand this history, we can perhaps better understand what to expect going forward. So a lot of people have looked at this with GDP, but there's now increasing information in the industrial ecology literature to look at the total mass consumption, or not mass consumption, but the mass stock here. They look at both, but here is the stock of mass in the global economy. So of all the materials that have been extracted and accumulated as buildings and roads and cars and factories, how much is that in the United States economy? I don't cite it here, I have it later, but this is Friedel and Krausman's paper of 2017. So if we look at the stock of materials and petagrams on the bottom, then you kind of have a similar relationship here. It's not exactly the same. It's only one set of data. If you estimated these numbers in another method, you might get some different slopes, but they generally seem to follow the same pattern, perhaps a superlinear scaling at small size of the economy, then near linear most of the 20th century, and then since the 1970s, a kind of sublinear scaling of mass and energy consumption, which it makes sense in the sense that machines are made out of mass and machines consume energy. And the structures like my home around lighting and air conditioners and other machines that consume energy are part of that structure. So this again points to wondering how to model the economy as a superorganism or this coordination of different kinds of mass, just like coordination of different cells. And my paper on my HARMONEY model, 2022, doesn't go into this too much, I do relate it to like a single organism, like a mammal. And if I plot some of the outcomes of my model here on the right in a similar way as we were looking at with the scaling, then it shows essentially a similar type of regime. There's an initial time period. If I'm growing the model here from a steady state, it's accumulating capital, investing and accumulating capital and population, and it's consuming natural resources on the y-axis to do that. So the y-axis is the resource extraction rate, which is equal to the consumption rate of the whole economy. And then on the bottom is capital. In my model, it's a little bit, it's not calibrated to a real world, so it's conceptually a physical accumulation of physical mass conceptually. And so you have a sort of superlinear pattern. It continuously turns into a sublinear pattern of growth until the economy ends up at a steady state at the upper right. And there is no more at the bottom. There's no more resource consumption for net growth. So the economy is not growing anymore in a net sense. It's at a steady state. And so that's why that goes to zero. So whether that's inherent in the model or just coincidence, I think it has to do with a similar structure, but just to state some relevant assumptions in my model, there are of course many that can affect this pattern. One, there's no consumption behavior. So in this particular paper, I assumed household consumption is just a residual from net output. So an investment is a decision by the two sectors in the model. Then there's intermediate consumption, and whatever's left over goes to household consumption, which affects birth rates, or affects death rates and affects the population. There's no change in labor productivity here. I don't assume that. That's just constant. There's no explicit concept of space or a network. I'm not trying to model that. But the one thing that is in here that essentially causes or is the main reason for this pattern is as the resource depletes, then there's the definition of resource depletion means that more resource consumption is required to get the next increment of resource extraction. So essentially, if you deplete the resource, this is to have a feedback of energy return on investment, so to say. So you're not allowed to consume more energy than it takes to extract the next bit of energy. So is this an implied network? Perhaps. It can be implying that as to get a resource, you're either having to go further away or something like this, or dissipating more energy to get the next bit of resource back to some location, but it's not explicitly stated. There is no explicit notion of it in the model. So this is what we are already discussing. Biological growth of organisms and superorganisms seems to occur alongside lower energy consumption per individuals. If I add more mass to an animal, each unit of mass on average consumes less energy, and the mass that I do add tends to consume less energy. And so does this hold for quote unquote individuals defined in perhaps multiple ways in the economy? If I add another individual item to the economy, does that have to consume less energy? Whether we consider that fitting of a definition of efficient or not. So what about individuals as units of physical capital? So here's just a couple plots I put in my book. So this is what, this is just saying what sublinear scaling in animals is. Metabolism per mass goes down as you accumulate more mass. And so if we look at the United States data here, this is just data for the United States on US cars and light trucks. On the y-axis is the fuel consumption per vehicle. Relatively easy now, but as we have electric cars, I'll have to be more fancy in calculating such a graph for the energy consumption of vehicles. And then on the x-axis is the number of cars and trucks. So it's a proxy measure of not mass, but just items. So numbers of cars and trucks. And so you get this downward trend, at least since the 1970s. So this would be consistent with the biological growth concepts. I add more cars and trucks. If I want to have more of them, each one of them needs to consume less, certainly at least after the 1970s. We can do the same. Here's a similar plot for homes, households in the United States. So this is total energy consumed per household on the y-axis, and then the number of households on the x-axis. And we can see, yeah, from 1949, 1972, this is going up. So every house that gets added is consuming more energy over time until you get to the 1970s again. And then after that, similar to the cars, every home added is decreasing its energy consumption. And if we think about agency, did anybody want to stop the green trend and decide or want to or have a desire to move to the red trend on the right? So a lot of people say, yes, we chose to get more energy efficient. But when I look at this, I'm not sure anybody chose to do it. I think we're forced to probably have less energy consumption due to environmental constraints. And then if you're going to consume less energy by sort of physical constraint, then you might as well try to be efficient and get the same services as much as you can. So this kind of brings up this kind of question of choice or modeling. Where do you put a behavior in something? There are the pattern on the left that I pointed out. There's cells in an animal that seem to be coordinating how much energy they consume as the animal grows. There's ants in a colony, as we discussed, and then there's machines, and of course there's people in the economy. But in terms of thinking global energy consumption, the human beings is themselves are not the explanation for the vast majority of primary energy consumption. So most of it is associated with machines. And so I'm just going to tie this to.
Excuse me, Carey.
Yeah,
can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah,
I will keep question for the ends, but it's just a very short one to clarify. Well, it's just well to understand the metabolic rate B. It's the energy that it can process, or it's the energy flow that it needs to stay alive.
All right, I'll just try to speak to this chart on the screen here. And from my understanding of this experiment is it's essentially all of the metabolism of all of the ants in the experiment, regardless of what they're doing. So it's in some sense an airtight chamber. There's a flow of air into the chamber that has no carbon dioxide. So they sort of purge the chamber of carbon dioxide and then calibrate the experiment. The air coming in has no carbon dioxide. The ants are doing something. They're metabolizing, so they're generating carbon dioxide, and then they're measuring the carbon dioxide coming out of the experiment. So that level of carbon dioxide flow rate here, so the y-axis is a flow rate, like whatever, milliliters per minute of CO2 production is the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions of the ants, if you will. And so then you have to infer by looking at videos and measuring them in other ways what the ants are actually doing. So in this case, it's not really a full ant colony. It's just an ant experiment, but it is the full metabolism of all the ants, some together.
Well, okay, I will rephrase my question just a bit. Is the ant in a steady state, like its size stopped growing when we're doing the measurement? Or is it in a process?
So these experiments are a matter of 2 or 3 hours. So it's just some ants walking around and doing some task, roughly continuing the same task, like collecting seeds and bringing them back to a spot in the experiment. So they're just measuring the steady state of this, roughly this activity. So the ants will end up with a certain number of ants walking around, a certain percentage of the ants walking around, and this will occur for a few hours. And so, yeah, that's my understanding here, is these measurements are a steady state level of activity of the ant experiment. So it's not a real colony. So there's no new ants being born from larvae, and there's no queen laying eggs or anything like this. It's just worker ants walking around. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, but so I would have the opposite conclusion, that it might means that actually some of the energy that is measured while observing these ants is not just the energy required for the existing colony to stay as it is, but part of it might be dedicated to growing.
Well, yeah, in this sense, they can't grow. Let's just say I put 100 ants in the experiment. There's only 100 ants the whole time, so there's no change in the number of ants. And again, it only takes a few hours to run the experiment. So the increasing mass here is just because you ran a separate experiment by adding more ants to the experiment as a second measurement.
Okay.
Yeah. And he put the ants into a very small chamber, and then he would put more ants into a very small chamber when he knew they weren't walking around. And then he gets a linear relationship of metabolism and mass of ants. So if they can't walk around, then they have a very low metabolism of just standing still, and that scales linearly with the number of ants. But as soon as you give them enough space to walk around, now you have a partitioning between some number of ants are walking around and some number of ants are standing still. And that's his explanation for how the scaling arises. It's whatever's governing how many ants get to walk versus don't walk around is affecting the scaling.
Because it's true that going back on Gail's remark, depending on whether we consider B as the energy that the ant colony can deliver, or the energy that it needs just to maintain itself, the conclusion is quite different actually on the scaling. On one side, it will mean that the colony becomes less efficient if when it grows, it can deliver less energy. On the opposite interpretation would be that it becomes more efficient if when it becomes bigger, as Gail said, you need less energy per ant to maintain itself. So yeah, it is difficult to interpret.
Yeah, a little bit. I agree with you. So here, at least in plotting this for my paper, I didn't answer your question, but I attempted to plot something that would help with these conversations. And I essentially calculated this, basal resource consumption. So in the model, I'm really tracking the dashed line, total resource extraction. And then I can calculate how much resource consumption is associated with growing the next mass, like investment, how much energy is associated with investment or net investment. And then the subtraction of those is this basal resource consumption. So in some sense, that's the amount of resources required if you were just to keep the economy at its current size. And then the gray line at the bottom is here's how much it is to accumulate another piece of capital. And because it takes energy to make that piece of capital and that kind of thing. So that's attempting to sort of understand your question.
Okay, yeah, I see.
So yes, it's hard to measure that. Well, at least in this experiment, I would claim for the ant experiments, there is no investment. So the investment for the ants here would be, laying eggs and caring for the larvae and raising them. That would be sort of the investment in more ants. And this experiment here is just doesn't even have that concept in it. It's just a short-term experiment. There's no raising of ants. There's just the ants that exist and performing some task. So you could run a similar experiment and cause them or try to induce them to do different kinds of tasks. And you say, if they do this task, it needs this much energy. And if they do this other task, it needs this other amount of energy. So that's the kind of ideas we've been thinking about. But so yeah, can you affect the scaling? How much can you affect the scaling in an ant experiment? And then if you can, learn how to do that. Does that help you think about the economy? So yeah, your questions are the same questions I have. Yeah. So this again is the data from the global economy here with energy consumption versus GDP. This is put into terms of annual consumption, or the growth rates rather, of primary energy on the left, and then growth rate of real GDP on the bottom. And each gray dot is a year of data, but then I made a very simple summary here, averaging the data together. And the the point here is that there's this kind of clockwise motion over time. So from the early 1900s until 1970s, the growth rates are increasing up and to the right along this 1-to-1 ratio that we already saw, the scaling, roughly a linear scaling between primary energy and GDP. And then after the 1970s, you end up with a sublinear scaling regime along this near a 2/3 ratio. So 3% growth in GDP associated with roughly a 2% rate of growth in primary energy. So anyway, the point here is you get the real world data seem to indicate this kind of clockwise motion. If I plot the same kind of thing with my results from my model, there are 4 lines here. They're just 4 different variations of the model. But the point here is that when I simulate it, I get a clockwise motion as well. And so it makes me think, okay, perhaps there's something going on here. It's for the same reasons we've already discussed. But in the model, my interpretation is there's a resource limitation built into the model. You can only grow to a certain size because it's as if the economy lives off of a forest. You can only extract a certain rate from the forest until you deplete it. And so the economy grows up and to the right, or it grows at an increasing rate. And then at some point, it's become so big that there's just no way to continue growing at that same rate. And it has to start shrinking because of slowing resource extraction capability. And the point is, it comes down to the right. It doesn't go back in the same path. It kind of comes down to the right. You've accumulated more mass, maybe some inertia effects, and these kinds of things. Now, I think Paul's in the room. Paul, I've been debating how to model or wanting to convert my model so that there's a behavior function for consumption in the sense of I spend some percentage of disposable income, or households are assumed to spend some percentage of their disposable income on goods or whatever is in the model. And he's helped me maybe get past a hurdle that was causing me some issues. And what seems to come out of this, it's not published, of course, but what seems to come out of this is that if you run the model in a similar way, on the right side, I basically assume that this extraction technology gets better. And essentially, for any given unit of capital that extracts resources, I need less, or I can extract more resources for a unit of capital. So it's like getting a better shovel, if you will, or you have a more effective machine to cut down trees from the forest. And so that's what induces the growth on the right. If I assume the same kind of thing on the left for a model of my same model, but reconfigured to have consumption as a behavior, then you get the pattern on the left. And what's not obvious here is that it goes at a counterclockwise motion. So now it starts from 0, 0 growth there, kind of on the lower left at a steady state, or if I set it up that way, and it goes to the right and around in a counterclockwise motion. And that's not what we observe in the real world economy, at least this pattern of growth over time. So I have a lot of questions as to how one chooses to model behavior in a macroeconomic model and how it influences what the results seem to be. So yeah, I'd like to, I'll follow up with people in the group on this particular question. So I suppose y'all are a bit more focused on socioeconomic outcomes, and I come at this from trying to understand physical relationships between in the economy and economic outcomes. So how much are these related to each other? It's a big question. As I presented last time, and Gail has seen this, that in my model I published, I have calculating the wage share again. This is just assuming that household consumption is behavior, and the wages can change according to the equation here at the top. There's the Phillips curve is the first term, and the second term is a term related to the rate of change of employment, and then the fourth term is a term related to inflation. So how much do wages change with inflation? And And so the results on the left assume that wages change with inflation by 100% factor. I guess you say money illusion, right? There's 100% money illusion, so that wages go up with inflation exactly. And the pattern on the left is the economy grows, and then when the wage share comes back up, the economy is slowing its growth and goes back to a steady state. So that's what's going on behind there. So if you have what I was calling full bargaining power or full money illusion in the model, you end up with these patterns where the wage share bounces back up at the end after the growth period. So that's, I'm just pointing out on the right the same data or the same simulated result. But if you reduce the bargaining power or take it away, then you end up with this wage share on the right that I'm pointing to, where the wage share will start to decline. So the only thing in the model that changes is that time 60, I take away slowly the W2 factor, or these factors that would increase wages with inflation and employment rate. And so in this particular case, the economy just keeps installing more capital, and the wage share goes down. I won't pay attention to that one. So the parallel here, so here's the wage share on the right, same chart I showed, and if you take away bargaining power. So again, full bargaining power on the right, after you grow, the growth cycle occurs, the wage share bounces back up to its earlier level. And on the left, I'm showing the capacity utilization of the capital. And there's two types of capital in the model. They both have the same basic pattern. So 0.85 here is just the targeted rate of capacity utilization. So if there's full bargaining power, the capacity utilization stays the same, roughly. If I have no bargaining power, if I take this away, I have two different forms of simulating cost or prices in the model. So prices based upon marginal cost only. If I take away bargaining power, the wage share goes down, and then it seems to stay at a lower level. And I'm pointing over to the equivalent simulation on the left for capacity utilization. So in this case, less wages allocated to workers is translated to more capital that doesn't operate as much. So the capacity utilization goes down. The same kind of thing happens for this full cost pricing. Full cost pricing means depreciation and interest payments are included in the prices. But again, if I take away the bargaining power, don't have to pay wages. The firms can just keep investing in more capital, but the capital actually can't be used because there's not enough energy resources to run the capital, so the capacity utilization goes down. So you accumulate capital, but the utilization rate just keeps going down at the expense of workers, you might say. So is there any reality to this? I don't know, maybe. Here's data from the United States, capacity utilization just for, I think, the industrial sectors. And since the 1970s, this capacity utilization has gone down slightly. It's not a huge, percentage, maybe from 0.85 to 0.75. And I looked at the data today, and now 2022, it's maybe closer to 0.8 now for the capacity utilization. And so there's the question of whether this is a similar kind of thing going on in my model. I see Gregor we have another question. So is declining capacity utilization just the same thing as a higher percentage of inactive ants in an ant experiment? Gregor, I don't know if you have a question again.
Yes, so sorry, I like asking them along the way.
That's okay.
Presentation. Thanks. It was just two quick economic questions. The second is related to what's plotted right now. I know apparently there's a lot of debates whether the long run rate of capacity utilization is endogenous or exogenous, but I don't know, it feels weird to me that it can be different than a normal rate of capacity utilization, which will be desired by the people in charge who possess the firms, because what would be their interest of continue investing in new capitals if 50% of the capitals were stayed idle, were unused in production. So, and so actually I would be interested in the source of your data on capital accumulation, just because I've been recently reading a bit of literature on that topic. And the other very quick economic question that I had, I was surprised because that's always present almost in what we do, that your Phillips curve does not generate any oscillation. So that would be the case if there was full money illusion, because in that situation, the prices, the firms are price giver, and actually their margin is decided by their pricing procedure and is independent of the state of the labor market. But if there is not full money illusion, then the assumption is that the Phillips curve acts at least on the real distribution of income. And in the Goodwin type model that we are used to handle, it's a mechanism that generates oscillation. And so I wonder why they were not present with this oscillation in the simulation.
Right. That probably can't fully answer your question on the oscillation. In some sense, it could be just due to other, parameters in the model. If you extract enough of the resource, then I can get some oscillations in the sense that I overshoot the maximum rate of resource consumption, and then it'll have some oscillations associated with the regeneration rate of the resource. As far as what I've explored so far, it's consistent with what you said in terms of if I switch the model and run it as if there is a consumer behavior or household behavior, then I do get kind of more of a oscillatory effect. And that was hidden in the one chart I showed you, but it was sort of present in there. So that seems consistent. And in terms of the capacity utilization, you can just, I just kind of look at data from the US Federal Reserve site here. So the data I got is just downloaded from there. And so this is not exactly the same thing I plotted, but this is pretty much what I showed here. And you can see that after 2020, the capacity utilization maybe is getting closer to 80%. So it's not a huge decline, at least in the United States, but it's something, I guess.
Yeah. It is.
Okay. So yeah, you're asking questions that I'd like also to know the answer to. So here is something more of a socioeconomic kind of idea. So I showed capacity utilization and wage share declining, at least for some types of scenarios in my model. And here's just the US data. It's the same thing I showed on the right. Now I have there the source. It's the capacity utilization. And then on the left here is the wage share as a percentage of GDP in the United States, which is the black line. So, starting in early 1970s, the wage share goes down. Starting in the early 1970s, capacity utilization goes down, right? How much do these things always go together because of physical linkages and operating machines and needing people to work on the machines that are operating? You break this kind of link. Is it an anomaly? Is it a real trend? These are all good questions, but it seems consistent with whatever my model, again, not calibrated to the US, is doing, or it is what it's doing, but it's not relating to the US specifically. Which gets me a little bit to the next bit, which is I'm working on calibrating my model to the United States data. So I'm trying to calibrate it to a real world. And so you can think, okay, just like there's industrial ecology data on mass of the global economy, now there's some about individual economies, and including the United States. So what I'm working on now is to take whatever parameters in my model are and relate them to real world stocks and flows, mass, energy, and money. And so the stocks will be types of physical capital, how much mass is in roads, how much is in buildings, how much is in manufacturing facilities, power plants, what kinds of types of capital and how do they relate to each economic sector. So if there's a resource extraction sector, how much capital and mass is in there, not just money, like actual physical items. So that'll help you understand how much energy that sector consumes. If it doesn't have a machine, in some sense, it can't consume the energy. And then, of course, relate this to, basically energy and mass inputs to operate this physical capital. So the chart on the left is the same thing I showed you earlier. So energy consumption per global material stock of the global economy. And on the right is the United States. Similar type stuff from another co-author who's in the same group as Friedel Kraussman. And so you get, you can get slightly different impressions from the US and the global data. The US data here from essentially 1870, estimates since 1870 until almost the present time, kind of show a sublinear scaling of energy consumption and mass stock in the United States throughout the whole period. So that's, in some sense different than the United States. We can think about the United States as one organism within the whole global economy. And then once you get the global economy before World War I and was not super integrated, but then after the 1970s, it is much more integrated. So maybe there is much more inherent coordination that would drive sublinear scaling on the global scale that was already being driven internally at a smaller scale in the United States. And so this is all materials, but they summarize different kinds of materials in this work. So you can say, okay, what if I take out I'm just calling it rocks. So all material in the economies except for rocks, and that's concrete, aggregate, essentially major building materials. According to the data source on the right, it seems like approximately 60 to 70% of all material stock in the United States is in roads. So essentially aggregate and concrete and asphalt making roads. So there's about 100 gigatons of material in the United States, and probably somewhere between 60 and 70 gigatons is roads. And again, mostly rocks. And so now you get a little bit of a different pattern. You get maybe sublinear scaling up until after World War II, and then there's obviously a tremendous growth rate or a superlinear scaling rate of accumulating materials and energy consumption, relating those two. And then after the 1970s, again, a slower rate. So we sort of know there was a big build out of, production of cars and homes and industrial goods after World War II. So they also have estimate of metals. So here is just, if you only look at the metals in the world data that they've accumulated, estimated, and for the United States. So now you get, maybe a slightly different view of what kind of materials are being added, what's their role in the economy in terms of energy consumption. These look a little bit more like a similar pattern for the world and the United States. And maybe, the United States and Europe is kind of dominating perhaps the use of metals in the earlier parts of these charts. So maybe that's not surprising, but again, definitely a higher rate of energy consumption per accumulation of metal mass, essentially in the mid-20th century until the 1970s, but again, a sublinear scaling in the 1970s. So I've been working through my postdoc, summarizing these stocks of mass of different kinds. And so if I add up all these different types of mass and try to associate them with different types of capital, which is on the upper, the columns, these different Ks. So buildings and structures, there's KRES for residential buildings. How much mass is in residential buildings? Perhaps, 7 or 8 gigatons, maybe. How much mass is in commercial buildings, industrial facilities, KLDVs, light duty vehicles, right? So we start to see how much mass is in each one of these areas, and then we can associate the energy consumption with each of these types of mass. So here's in the middle, this transport infrastructure, so 63,000 million tons or 63 gigatons. So that's effectively, it's us trying to estimate, that's basically 63% of all mass is just in roads. So the roads themselves don't consume energy, but of course they facilitate vehicle traffic that does consume the energy. So this is Now we're trying to break into at least manageable number of types of capital for each column, and then associate the ownership of this capital to each economic sector, which is represented by the rows. And then each of these economic sectors would have some investment behavior and perhaps a consumption behavior for households that would be competing to, accumulate this mass for their function. And so I'll end here. So we take energy consumption in the United States, and there's different types of mass. And the question is, okay, for every unit of mass of these different types, how much energy do they tend to consume? And, I'm hoping this is a step towards relating more of this sort of biological growth, if you will, to modeling the economy. Here's these different types of things that can be added. They have a certain function for the economy. And can we understand if we were to change the build out of the economy, go to low carbon infrastructure, for example, how much more mass would need to be added? Can we associate that with the monetary investment? Where would that be added in the economy? So we can see a few things here. The transportation other section, this 0.44, that's like pipeline. So for every kilogram of pipeline, there's about 0.4 megajoules per year consumed. This is pretty much oil and gas pipelines. This is a rough estimate. We could probably consider all these with it, plus or minus 50 or 100% accuracy, if not more. So this is all fairly preliminary. Residential buildings and commercial buildings, maybe 1 to 2 for every kilogram of mass in the building. There's 1 to 2 megajoules of energy consumed a year. Light duty vehicles, it's just a little bit more straightforward to calculate, but vehicles maybe tens of megajoules, 30 to 100 megajoules per kilogram of vehicle. The other vehicle here, other vehicles are like heavy duty trucks and these kinds of things. And then we have power plants, of course, on the right. On the far right is transmission and distribution of the power grid. So this 3.6 is an estimate of, this is just saying of the US transmission and distribution grid dissipates about 5.7% of its electricity generation through resistive losses. So this is, for example, the resistive losses of electricity per kilogram of transmission and distribution infrastructure. So this is, so that's kind of, what I've been thinking theoretically behind the scenes, and then practically trying to translate my model more to a real world economy to see if the same patterns that seem in the very simplified model, see if they maintain themselves in the calibrated model. So I'll stop there for any other questions, and thank you, Gregor, for asking the questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We usually go for questions online first and then questions inside the room. So is there anybody online that would like to ask a question? Yes, Grégoire?
Yeah, sorry. I already asked most of my question actually, but I just wanted first to give you a reference. You probably already know it, and actually I have it on my files, but I haven't read it yet. So I can just mention its existence. It's papers by Geoffrey West, so one of the guys who contributed to the giving a theoretical explanation to the allometric scaling of organism, right? In partnership with another person called Betancourt, and they try to apply this to cities. And I haven't read the paper yet, but maybe you have, in this case, I don't know.
Yeah, I've read several of their papers, and I can't, recount their math to you directly, but yeah, the paper on scaling on cities, my takeaway is I think they've, at least in terms of energy, I think it might have been only at least the one I read on the electric grid. And in a sense, as the city, they are mostly scaling with population, not physical mass accumulation of capital. So there's a little bit different take on it there. But as they were saying, yeah, if you have, they have superlinear scaling of energy consumption in a city with people. So more people in a city, more energy consumption. So that was one of the, or at least a superlinear scaling. So 10 times more people, more than 10 times, I think, the electricity consumption, which is different than physical infrastructure. So they were kind of positing that these two things play off of each other, like the length of roads. So you have 10 times more people in a city. You have sublinear scaling with road length. So you'd have less than 10 times more road length. So so I'm familiar with some of that work, and I'm not 100% sure how to think about cities and the macroeconomy. Obviously, they're related, but it would be good to understand a little bit more of that. And obviously more, people are accumulating in cities over time. And whether that's a choice or it's sort of a forced mechanism in order to grow, I don't know. I think Jeffrey West is also sort of considering the idea that, you can't just keep doing this forever, right? If you have more and more people going to cities and they consume more electricity than otherwise, that that pattern will not continue forever.
Otherwise, so the question actually has already been asked at least twice, but I ask it again. And I mean, you already answered it. It's just to note really that, so it's super interesting to try applying this consideration to the macroeconomy. I'd love to look more into that. Takes more time. I can do it on my side. But yeah, initially I was confused by the first diagram that you showed with the scaling between energy consumption and mass, but because I thought it would be the flow of mass, maybe of circulating capital, or the mass that needs being processed by the economy, or flow and not a stock. And if that would have been the case, I would have expected a different trend, because if the material environment is getting is being degraded by human activity, that we have increasingly to go reach less accessible resources of lesser quality. It's the opposite scaling that we would expect, right? To process the same quantity of useful materials, we will have to use more energy. But so actually, the measure that was taken seems to have been the stock, not the mass that is being processed, but the mass of the infrastructure of the economy. Is that right? This is just to understand better, and then I'm done.
Yes. So yeah, what I showed, so inherent in the data or the papers that I'm using, they have, inflows of materials and outflows of materials, mass. But what I showed you, yes, was the stock of mass. So the idea was, most of the literature discussing biological metabolism was showing the stock of mass of the animal. So I was just trying to make the most direct translation to plotting versus the stock of mass of the economy. But yeah, we could certainly look at the mass and energy flows. I think I actually have plotted that in there. I mean, they're roughly 1-to-1 in the US and global data. There's a little shift in the pattern around, before World War II, essentially, as in many economic data, but they're much closer 1-to-1 relationships. So in terms of, flow of mass, flow of energy.
Okay. Makes sense. It's 1-to-1, I guess.
So are there other questions online? Yes, Alejandro?
Yes, sorry. First of all, congratulations on Dr. Carey, Dr. King, sorry. It's a very interesting paper. I know it's not a paper, it's the result of a book that you published recently, but as far as I know, you are engineering, a young economist. So can you try to in a few words, try to explain any consequence, any suggestion of the point of view that you develop in your paper or in your work. So you try to understand the behavior of our world in sense of energy consumption, analyzing the ant colony and some superorganisms, and our goal is so similar like this kind of behavior. So can you translate this in some suggestion, concrete suggestion, or I don't know, something that could be really connected with the economic situation in terms of energy and the use of the energy? Is it possible? It is only a description of one reality that can be explained another way? Because I have not so clear. Remember, I am non-engineering, I am an economist. I try to see with these glasses how can we impulse this kind of problem that we have in our world. Thank you.
Right. I suppose I don't have harder to have the answer, but I phrase this to people trying to get them interested in sponsoring the research, which I guess I view it as telling people the normal, usual way of people, economists, studying these problems, say using neoclassical growth theory, and having a lot of these things we're talking about are exogenous or not, just sort of not even conceptually able to be included in the framework. That people will make statements with some authority and say that various a sequence of outcomes can occur at the same time. And then when I start thinking more about how the economy works and looking at the data, I think it's not obvious that these sequence of things can all occur at the same time. So, high wages, more low carbon energy, and the economy grows, and you don't accumulate too much debt and interest payments, or you won't have a financial collapse, these kinds of things. So I kind of try to explain to people that I think the tool to answer these questions are not readily available. And I think the groups, that I'm speaking with here, are working on these kinds of questions. And that's why I like speaking with you. So that's not an answer to your question. That's more of just why I'm doing the research. At some level, you think, if we're going to go to renewable energy more, by definition, there are more capital and less operating costs, or lower capacity utilization. Does something like that translate into lower wages? I mean, the economy in general is sort of accumulating. If you're accumulating capital that needs less human interface or human operation, labor per unit of capital, then that seems like a trend towards less wages, unless you counteract it, somehow. Who owns this gets into the question of who owns the capital and all this kind of a thing. So my hypothesis is that without a real physical basis to understanding the economy, we can't answer the questions about equity of social outcomes. And that this is kind of what I tell people, and that most economic models just assume that this linkage, it just doesn't even consider it. Yeah, when we look at the real data, it seems to be happening. The change in trend of the 1970s, to me, seems to be, it's the sort of the most stark change in how the economy operates in the data we can observe. And it still seems that maybe there's not the analysis out there that says, yes, this is how we can explain the change in these scaling trends from the 1970s, relate to the resource size, social changes, or did they happen simultaneously or not? I had someone there was a conference here, and there was someone from American Civil Liberties Union, so ACLIO. I think he was their chief, sort of policy person. And I was trying to explain some of these things. I know better now how to explain them than at the time. But he says, he's like, it wasn't energy. It was, labor bargaining power. And, Reagan and Thatcher came in and signaled that unions didn't have power and they were going to fire workers if they went on strike and all this kind of a thing. And so I was like, I don't doubt what you're saying, but my question is, were those policies, did those policies only become acceptable because there was an energy constraint? If there was no energy constraint, why would anyone cared to elect people who would have enacted such policies? You'd have just kept keeping the wage share high and consuming more and more energy. So I think that's kind of really the big question. How much are the social decisions about arranging the economy, in some sense, limiting the social options, choices, or trade-offs? Yeah.
Okay, we can discuss a little bit more about it, but okay, it's fine. It's fine.
I'm open. Yeah, I'm open for people. Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah, I'd like to hear all ideas on it. So yeah.
Yeah, it is true. I am neoclassical approach. I use a computational generative model, but it is true. You can introduce other goals in your model, not only to maximize GDP. You can include other issues, including energy consumption, using, for example, multi-criteria decision making. So this is possible. It is true. It's not the mainstream. It is true, but it's possible to give a solution in this kind of neoclassical approaches. But anyway, it's very nice to see this kind of presentation from other point of view to complement my approach in this case. So congratulations and thank you.
Right. Yeah, my economic history course is relatively limited, and I latched onto the sort of post-Keynesian framework because it's most similar to the engineering type modeling that I'm used to. So it was easy to make sense out of it. So yes, it'd be great to say, here's this general model structure definition. If you apply these different approaches, can they all explain the transition in the 1970s, or can only some of them explain this transition in the 1970s? Then we might understand which of them are valid for thinking about a low carbon transition. So that's the motivation, a lot of it.
Thank you. Are there other questions online? Otherwise, I think we've got some in the room. Okay, so let's go inside the room. Is there any question left? Yeah.
Questions. No, it was just first suggestion about the end scaling and metabolism, which is, do you know if Chen had measured the quantity of seeds accumulated depending on the time of one experiments for each size of colony? Because what I feel is that it's always the issue with energy, which is we can easily measure metabolism or dissipated energy, but it's much harder to measure the useful energy. And here in that case, the role of ants is to accumulate some seeds, and they're going to consume some seeds by the way. So there's also some dissipation in this. So if we have a measurement of the flux of seeds by measure per unit of capital, we might have a kind of exergy emerging from that, which I think would be relevant for that experiment. So it was just a random idea I had, but I'm all here for.
Right. Yeah, I'm agreeing with you, Paul. Yes. So what I didn't show here that some of you are aware of, it would be, my goal in the economic modeling would be to include an efficiency of conversion of primary energy into the work done by the machines in the economy, much as you're talking about the total metabolism of ants and relating it to the work done actually by the ants, perhaps as moving seeds from one location to another. So that, and for those of you who are unaware, the motivation for that is that if you calculate the work done by the machines in the economy or people doing this, there seems to be a much more one-to-one relationship to gross domestic product. So it's not only about primary energy, it's about primary energy times efficiency converted into useful work. Right?
And that's, I think that's something which will be very important, especially with the energy transition, which is if you consider fossil fuel energy, you're dissipating a lot of energy in order to transform your gas energy into light, useful light energy, and switching to photovoltaic technology is going to drastically shift the energy conversion chain, which if we just measure the gross energy dissipation would be misleading in that case in order to understand the energy transition. I know that a lot of, in France, a lot of people are like forgetting that point, and so seeing dramatic changes in the issues of energy, but like this kind of intermediate chain of the energy transition looks more than important in order to really grasp the energy issue in the final sector.
Right. Yeah. So there's a good question of how much, I don't know, energy accounting, if you will, in some sense matters versus monetary costs. And I guess as you're perhaps aware, yeah, how do you count the primary energy of solar or wind power? And yeah, most accounting doesn't even include the efficiency of the solar panel or the wind turbine, right? So the primary energy is the sunlight and the wind. But normal International Energy Agency accounting would just say, once you get electricity, that's 100% primary energy. So that doesn't even include the efficiency of the photovoltaic panel. So the question is, yeah, is that misleading? Do we need the efficiency of the photovoltaic panel in there or not? Obviously, it depends on land and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's definitely have a goal to understand what you're saying here a little bit more directly. Yeah. Is it for the same amount of capital, do you get more work or less work out? It's probably a trade-off of land and other things that maybe start to get harder to shove into the energy bucket of understanding.
My suggestion on that is that with the type of framework we're using, it's mostly a question of intermediate consumption, which is if you want to transform gas to light, you will have more sector of transformation, and taking into account each transformation, in fact, is going to improve the amount of consumption through the intermediate consumption. So that might be a kind of proxy of the exergy through this type of intermediate consumption approach. So I think the type of framework we are using is not that far away. It's just the way we interpret it, but we have some work to do.
Right. Yeah, I'm agreeing again. So yeah, that's part of the motivation, and that's why when I started doing this modeling, someone asked me why did I make it so complicated. I at least made 2 sectors, and the reason I wanted to have at least 2 sectors was to track intermediate consumption of resource transformation. So yeah.
Yeah. So Carey, thanks a lot for this presentation. I have a few questions. If you go back to your graph where you plot GDP versus primary energy consumption, quite at the beginning of your talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if you look
yeah, go ahead.
Now the fact that it becomes sublinear after the 70s, if you think of the fact that we know that extraction costs have increased because of the depletion, let's say, of fossil fuel. For instance, we know that the US has reached its peak oil in 1970. So actually, that's a quite amazing increase of efficiency in terms of GDP. That is, for $1 additional of GDP, you need less energy. You see?
Yeah.
So for an economist, it's obvious. That's a sign of an increase of efficiency. This was the first remark I wanted to make. If you compare it with mass or whatever, a physical quantity, I agree that it's ambiguous. But now for GDP, for an economist, it's clear. That is, the energy intensity of GDP is declining, which means GDP production or value production is more efficient in terms of energy consumption, at least since the 70s. Now, the second point I wanted to mention is that if you go back to your chart with a clockwise pattern, you remember that?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this one, exactly. So actually, that's very interesting because there are a number of economists who are wondering whether, in which direction goes causality between energy consumption and GDP. So now that you have this type of patterns, it means the causality goes from energy consumption to GDP, because actually it's energy consumption which is declining first, and then GDP which is declining, and not the other way. Had you a trigonometric wise pattern, this would be exactly the opposite. So for me, it's a clear evidence of the fact that the causality runs in one direction, from energy consumption to GDP, and not the other way. And I think that's very important. There is a literature devoted to this. The guy who wrote a lot on this is David Stern, not
Right.
Nick Stern, David Stern, the Australian guy. And I think that's very, very illuminating. Now, on the question, at a certain point, you were considering energy consumption of machines versus energy consumption of households. You remember that?
Yeah, they were just 2 examples. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems to me here there is a big difference, which is that if you look at a machine, I'm okay with you. If you look at households, we should also take into account the distribution inside households. because we also know that in the 70s, inequalities have started again to increase. So it might be that on average, you know, we made a lot of progress, but actually it's just because a few people have access to a lot of energy and the rest of the population has a declining energy consumption. You see what I mean?
Right.
So regarding households, I would believe that, you know, the average is a little bit misleading in the sense that we would definitely need to have at least, you know, the Gini coefficient or any measure of inequality in terms of energy consumption. You see what I mean?
Yeah. So I've tried to think if there's, you know, I guess you can clearly risk taking the analogy too far, but yeah, our bodies have some average, whatever, energy consumption per mass. And each part of our different organs in our bodies consume energy at a different rate. So it's not like we have a uniform mass. And so there's, you know, the question, in order to adjust to this sublinear scaling, is that a some set of a requirement, or does that always come out? There's another paper, I don't recall, but it essentially poses that, you know, the idea of Zipf's law, or, you know, hierarchical organization of items, comes from just the idea that you put things into a bin of definition. So I define my body as being part brain, part heart, part lungs, part skeletal muscles. And the imposition of this paper is that just by categorizing things, you will get a hierarchy of, in this case, energy consumption, just like you would get a hierarchy in the frequency of words that appear in a book, even though there's no physical relationship in the book. So I don't know the answer, but if you end up in the sublinear scaling regime, is this, by definition, some parts, when you bin them together, they're going to consume less than other parts. And as we grow our bodies, you know, we mostly add muscles and bones are very low energy per mass compared to heart and brain that don't grow as much when we grow. So I don't know how much of that is, you know, has come to be because of real evolutionary pressures on growth or in constraints. My guess is something like that would be my hypothesis. Your first question was, on the causality or other other kinds of things. So so that to me is, I mean, that's kind of why I'm interested in doing this paper. And we obviously follow up. And when I talk with Paul, it looks like he's kind of I had a problem I couldn't solve in terms of an equation, and I think he came up with a method to deal with it. But the fact that in my mind, I've tried to make the model as similar as I can, but you have to solve the equations differently. And so two different macroeconomic approaches, or two different model formulations to the same basic structure, produce in maybe seemingly two different causalities here. And so that's, to me, the interesting question is, how do we know if one's more correct versus the other? I don't know, and maybe we'd be able to figure it out. Again, as I kind of stated, there's no network concept in this at all. So maybe the one on the left is, hey, if we added the idea of a network, maybe it would do the same pattern, but it would be on a sublinear slope. It wouldn't be on this one-to-one slope line. I don't know.
Okay, I guess we have to discuss this. We have to discuss this further.
Yeah. So I think to me that's where we can collaborate. To me, that's a great.
Oh, sure.
Here. Yeah, because
and maybe I had a last observation, which is regarding, I think it's the last slide that you showed, computing the ratio between energy consumption or energy dissipation divided by mass. Yeah. So I'm sure you know, because I guess we already discussed this. This is a ratio that is used by Chesson, you know, in his work, and he understands it as a measure of complexity. Whether he's right or not, it's another issue, but that's what he claims, you see. And I'm just wondering whether this is correct, because the mass concept puts at, you know, on par both, let's say, a computer chip and a pebble. And this is a little bit misleading, I believe, because if you look at cars, for instance, we know that our cars today are much more efficient in terms of energy consumption. They're also lighter, but at the same time, the energy that they consume has increased because now they have a computer on board, they have a GPS, etc., etc. You see,
Yeah.
and so the mass cannot capture that. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement. So I'm at the early stages of doing this. So I have a simple statement and then a more complicated one. The simple statement is, I'm going to try to press the limits of my modeling framework. And the modeling framework says I extract some mass and I turn it into stuff. So I need to know how much mass turns into things. There's a separate concept of, now that you have a mass of something, a car versus a building, what does it actually do? And what's not stated here is I'll try to estimate the efficiencies of these types of capital, which will be governed by the machines in them, right? The internal combustion engine in a car, the air compressor in a air conditioner in a home, for example, as well as the prices. So in this sense, I'll have my goods sector is the largest one. It's the sector that manufactures everything effectively. And so it'll take in one unit of mass and spit out less units of mass as capital, because there'll be some loss of materials. And this mass of capital that comes out will be more highly valued than the mass of materials that comes in. And that will be, at least at a basic level, this approximation of different values of different types of things. So if the goods sector makes a car, a light duty vehicle, it will have more value per mass than a residential building, money per mass. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull this off, but that's what I'm thinking.
I think
I just have a.
no, it's just that we're running out of time, so I think we'll have to stop at some point.
The very first proposal for this is that if we take the example of a car with the electronic inside, the electronic is made with using another type of capital, which is very capital intensive. So maybe the answer to that is to consider into the equation a part of the mass of a capital which were used to generate that. And I think we should have, this is more like forward measuring and our scope 1. And if we look at the scope 2 and we invert some of the matrices of capital, we might get a better solution.
Right. Yeah, I've had similar discussions with another colleague about, microchips. And he's like, yeah, but we're using much less material. And per Paul's ideas, well, to make one microchip, you need this really big building around in the factory to make the microchip, right? And so can we capture that idea? Can we capture that coupling as
Right. So thank you very much again. Well, to everybody for attending, and to you, Dr. King, for presenting today. That was very interesting. And we'll have a presentation next week, I think, with Gal.
Yeah.
So I hope you will be many there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Gael. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.